Hi, we're back again. We're going to give this a go one more time. For some reason, it again disappeared. This morning's story. So we're going to try one more time to see if we can tell the story of Bessie, Swope, Dillman, Swain, who was a woman who lived here in Vernal. I had a very interesting story that we'd like to share with you today. Bessie, or Elizabeth was her real name, but she always went by Bessie, lived in Iowa. She was born in 1888 in Missouri, but her parents moved up to Iowa when she was very small. And so she was raised in the Iowa area. When she was a young woman, she went to Indiana College, and while she was there, she met a young boy from Vernal, Utah, whose name was Henry Elmer Dillman. Henry was a mortician, but at the time they didn't call them morticians. At the time they called them undertakers. And he was an undertaker here in the Vernal area. His father had been known to be an undertaker, but really he never had a huge business at that. He did make some coffins for people and did facilitate a few funerals, but he never considered himself in business as an undertaker. When Elmer got old enough that he wanted to do his own thing, he wanted to be a rancher, and he had words with his father. They didn't see eye to eye, and eventually he went off to school. He received a embalming certificate and training at the Eccles School and was able to do embalming on people who had passed away, which was a fairly new opportunity for people, because that was not what they had been doing in the past. Most people who passed away were taken care of by friends or family, and they would arrange a memorial or funeral for them. And it was just a new profession when Dillman's came to Vernal, and in 1907 was when you first started seeing Elmer begin his advertising in the paper as a certified, bona fide undertaker. And so it wasn't until 1908 that he met Bessie. And so he was out there in Iowa, and from what we hear, he was taking some training at the time. But he already had his embalmer certificate. And so she knew she was marrying a caretaker, or an undertaker. I'm going to flip the camera and let you see what she looked like at the time. Wasn't she a beautiful woman? I look at that beautiful hair that she has on her head and think, wow, amazing. And if you see her pictures through her life, which I'll be sharing with you, you'll see that she kept that beautiful hair her whole life. She had been training to be a teacher, and she also took some classes in sewing, and she fell in love with Elmer, and they decided to marry, and he brought her to Vernal. She began teaching in the area, so she was a teacher here, and he was beginning his business as an undertaker. He was very new, and there was one other undertaker in town. His last name was Trim, and he had most of the jobs. He would do like 32 in a year, and Elmer was only doing a few, like up to 10. So it was really hard for him to break into the business here in the Vernal area in the beginning. And so he worked for the Vernal Co-op. He worked for the Vernal drugstore. There was even a period of time when he left to go out to a ranch and took her with him, of course. And they tried ranching for about a year, but then they came back to Vernal, and he put more effort into trying to get his business as Undertaker going. It's an interesting story about how Undertakers were thought of in those days. The word Undertaker came from the notion that a woodworker, a cabinet maker, or someone the family trusted would undertake for caring for a person who had died. Sometimes it included making a coffin. Sometimes it included making arrangements for burial. Moving from a parlor to a funeral home meant that men who were undertakers were a parlor. They had no certification, and once they became a home, they were certified. In the early years, there were no laws or regulations. As time went on, they were enacted. Undertakers were either friends that helped out or acting undertakers. So people were considered undertakers when they were friends, and they were willing to share all of this with their neighbors. They were trying to be kind and compassionate to their family and friends. There was a man in the Vernal area. He lived actually in Naples, who made many, many coffins in the early years that he came here to Vernal, and he never considered himself an undertaker. It was a job that he did just out of friendship and love. He is quoted as saying, "My wife and I were grateful when an undertaker established himself in the Uinta Basin." During the early days, friends and family members were named on death certificates more than undertakers. So undertakers became the one who signed the death certificates. But there was still an equal amount of family and friends that were doing that at the time that Elmer began. These acts of kindness at the time of death are evidence of a close community. So this was a very kind way of people helping each other when things were hard. I wanted to show you an advertisement of the Dillman funeral home. He really didn't call it, he just called himself a funeral director, a licensed embalmer, and an undertaker. He didn't really call his business building anything specific more than that. But this is a advertisement that he had in the newspaper in the first years of his work. Special attention is given to fumigating, which was an interesting thing. In those days, the embalmer would, the undertaker who did embalming would usually have a portable embalming kit that he would take with him to these homes of people who had died. He would work with the body and embalm it, dress it, and then the body would be on view in the home rather than going to a funeral home or somewhere like that. it was very common practice at the time, and that they would stay at home until they held the funeral. But he did purchase a building where he could do business, and it was on First South here in Vernal. It would be right where the cleaners are. They're on First South, just behind Zions Bank, and that's where he did his business. Just 2 doors down, there was another Undertaker, who was the one I told you about before, and Elmer just really did struggle there for a while to be able to get enough clientele for himself. But in, I believe it was 1912, he bought out the other man, and then he was the only Undertaker in town for a while, and his business grew. He was doing really well, and in 1918, during the end of the World War I, there was, as you know, the Spanish flu came to the area really strongly, and he was running from one end of the county to the other, trying to help with funerals for 75 to 79 people, if I remember my numbers right. One night he got stuck in a storm. It ended up with him catching the flu himself, and he passed away. With so many people that needed help at that time, his wife, Bessie, decided that she needed to continue his work. And so she went ahead and did the funerals for the rest of the people. They had been married for 10 years, and they had 5 children at the time of his death. So she was a busy mother, but she knew that it would be really hard for her to be able to help her children and support them correctly on a teacher's wage. So she decided to continue his business. She did not have a certification for embalming, and so, but she did have a certification for holding funerals, and so she just continued to do his work. She knew how to lay out the bodies and to help in the grieving process for the families, and she was actually the only Undertaker here in the Vernal area. She's such a beautiful woman. I look at her and I think, what a courageous thing for her to do. She did not stay. Oh, I did want to tell you one thing. Her husband's embalming tools are available to see at the DUP, the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers here in Vernal. Unfortunately, they won't be opening this summer as far as we have heard. They will be closed, but when they do open up, if you're interested, you can go and see his embalming tools. In 1 year later, when she remarried Mr. Swain. And this was a picture from a later period of time, but it was the only one that I could find where they were together. Of course, they had to change the advertisement for their business because they had a new last name, and so it was now considered the Swain Funeral Home, and it was the same building that her husband had right there on 2nd South. And this was what their advertisement started to look like. I think it's really interesting. The wording is, perfect beauty is one of the elements that contributes so much to peace and comfort in our every service. When the needs arises, let us serve. The Swain Funeral Home. Now, her husband did help her in the business, but she was the Undertaker. He was not. He helped her with coffins, and they had coffins that they made, and they also ordered in coffins so that they could have the needs of the people met in the area. She was the Undertaker of our area for 43 years. That's a long time. She never did receive a certificate for embalming. She went to go get trained, but one of her children was taken ill, and so that was the end of that. Her children, she had 5 more children with Mr. Swain, and one of her sons from the Dillman, from Elmer Dillman, became a funeral director over in Roosevelt, and 3 more of her sons also went to training so that they could be funeral directors. So it kind of ran in the family, and she had a lot of help through the years. In 1924, the building that they had their business in burned. She lost all of the equipment and all the things that she had inside that building. So she moved her business to her home. And this was their home. They took 2 rooms of the house and made them into the funeral area. There was 1 room she used for preparing the bodies, and the other room was used for her to have the funeral, or to do the viewing of the family member until the funeral. So she was in a small home with a lot of children, a lot of family, and yet they made it work. She taught her children to have great respect for the dead, to have compassion and love for those who they served. And one of her daughters was willing to give up her bedroom so that they could use the home for the funeral. And they did use them for many, many years. This was their business, their home, and their funeral home. So, very interestingly, she eventually purchased a hearse that was also an ambulance, and she went into the ambulance and the Undertaker business. At the time, they had an older vehicle, and they used that only to do funerals in the Rangeley area because the roads were so bad. They didn't want to mess up the new car. They were on call to do funerals and take bodies to faraway places and bring bodies from faraway places. They also were doing their ambulance work from Vernal to Salt Lake and from Vernal to Denver. There's one story where there was an accident here in the Vernal area, and 2 women were hurt really badly. One of them was unconscious. They needed to get them to the Denver hospital. And so they took the hearse ambulance and they rushed out of town. The one woman didn't gain consciousness till they got to Craig, Colorado. They continued onward and made it from Vernal to Denver in 10 hours, which the emergency workers were just amazed that they were able to get them there so quickly. They were very efficient and very caring people. When World War II broke out, she had 4 sons who had to go to war. That was a little unusual for that many. Here in Vernal, there were several families that did have 4 go, but no one knows of anyone who had 5 of them go. She was very dedicated to trying to help the soldiers that came through Vernal. She would feed them and lodge them if they had no place to go. There were times when she was known to have housed and fed over 100 soldiers in just 1 month. Her youngest son was only 19 when he joined the U.S. Army paratroops. His name was Lawrence, and he was reported killed in action in just a couple weeks after he made his first assignment. In the newspaper, there was a really interesting article about that, and I'm just going to read it to you because I thought it was so beautiful. It says, a mother had 4 strong sons who marched away to battle against the invader. The youngest was only a boy. A few months passed and a messenger came saying, your youngest child is slain. The mother went aside to a quiet place and prayed for her 4 strong sons, but always she prayed longest for him who was gone. Her prayer for this one was answered. Friday, Mrs. Bessie Swain of Vernal received a letter from her son Lawrence Robert Swain, 19, of the U.S. Army paratroops. Reported killed in action on foreign soil, he is now a patient at the Army Hospital in Fort Travis, Texas. He enlisted in the paratroops in April of 1942. On September 18th, he embarked for a foreign port. November 14th, he arrived in America. His left side and hip pierced from shrapnel, his body scarred with multiple wounds, but with spirit undaunted. He wrote, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm doing fine." Lawrence was awarded 3 Purple Hearts for injuries. He was first injured in Guadalcanal, and again in Italy, and his last time was in 1944. He was in a French hospital, but he always returned to battle after he healed. All 4 of her sons came home safely. Can't imagine what it would have been like to have been told that your son was gone, and then the joy of finding out that he was still alive. She was also very much an active member of the community. She joined many clubs in Uinta County. She was part of the Thalia Club, the Utopia Club, the DUP, or Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, the Ladies Kingsbury Aid, also known as the Community Ladies Aid, the Past Noble Grand Club of the Rebecca Lodge, the American Legion Auxiliary, Vernal's BPW, or Business Professional Women's Club, And not only was she a member of those clubs, she was busy and excited and always hosting, she was always in the paper. Almost every week there was a column where they would have club news, and she was always part of the club news because she was so busy in those days trying to get everything done. I think of her as a marvel. In 1951, she finally sold her business to the Jolly family, who were morticians in this area for many years. 43 years of giving kindness, aid, and love to her community. It's just amazing to me what this woman accomplished in her life. After she retired, she did some traveling. Her family had moved to many places throughout the country. There was one of her sons that was working with her close to the end of her career, but most of her sons were in other areas. And so she would go and visit them and spend time with them. Also, her daughter here in town, Isabel Batty, if you may remember Isabel, she and her husband purchased a motel, and Bessie would work in the office of that hotel for about 10 years. She passed away when she was 84 years old in 1974, having lived a full life full of charity and kindness and energy. She just amazes me as a person. I hope you enjoyed our story about Bessie Swain today, and that she was a very influential person doing a job that was very unusual for women at the time. I hope you'll come and see us next week as we find one more courageous woman's story to share with you.